The county courthouse stood tall against the autumn sky, its stone walls weathered yet dignified, carrying with them the echoes of decades of justice. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Every corner of the room seemed weighed down with tension. The polished wooden benches creaked as spectators shifted uneasily, the air thick with anticipation. The trial that had brought everyone here was no ordinary case. It was a high-profile matter, one that carried both emotional weight and legal complexity. The defendant sat stiffly beside his attorney, his hands clasped tightly, his jaw locked as though bracing for impact. Across the aisle, the prosecutor organized her papers into neat stacks, her movements deliberate, every gesture reflecting preparation and control. At the center of it all, the judge presided with quiet authority. He adjusted his glasses on the bridge of his nose, surveying the room with a steady gaze that could silence even the boldest. His robe was simple, yet the authority it represented loomed large over everyone seated before him. The jury, 12 men and women of varying ages and backgrounds, sat upright, most of them clutching notepads, as if their pencils could anchor them against the storm of testimony they were about to hear. Among the audience, in the very back row, sat a young mother with her daughter. She looked nervous, perhaps not entirely sure if bringing the child had been a wise decision. But circumstances had left her no choice. The little girl was only 3 years old, too young to grasp the seriousness of what was happening around her. Her mother had whispered several times, "Sit still, sweetheart, this is very important." But the toddler's world was different from the solemn faces and legal jargon that surrounded her. For the child, the courtroom wasn't a battleground of truth and consequence. It was simply a large, echoing room filled with strange people wearing serious expressions. She didn't understand the significance of the defendant's fate or the pressure weighing on the shoulders of the jury. All she knew was that she was supposed to sit quietly, but patience was not a virtue 3-year-olds easily mastered. She swung her small legs, her shoes tapping rhythmically against the wooden bench. She toyed with her fingers, gazed around at the rows of people, and then rested her chin on her mother's arm. "Why is everyone so quiet?" she whispered, her voice a soft melody against the hushed backdrop. Her mother gave her a quick, tight smile. "Because this is serious, honey," she replied, gently patting the child's hair. "We have to listen." The girl blinked her big eyes, not fully understanding, and turned her gaze forward again. To her, the people in suits looked funny. Some were shuffling papers, others whispering. Even the man in black, sitting high above everyone else, looked like he was simply waiting for something to happen. In the innocence of her mind, it was almost like a play, only there were no colors, no music, no laughter. Just silence. The bailiff cleared his throat, announcing the continuation of the trial. A witness was expected to testify, and all attention shifted toward the doors. The jury straightened, pens ready. The lawyers braced themselves. The judge leaned slightly forward, preparing to oversee the proceedings. But in the midst of all this, the little girl's attention drifted. She didn't notice the tension tightening the air. She didn't care about the whispers of the reporters scribbling in their notebooks. She was far too young to sense the gravity of what was unfolding. All she knew was that she wanted something to happen, anything that might break the dull stillness. And then the heavy wooden door creaked open. The sound was ordinary, but in that room, every small noise seemed amplified. Heads turned, eyes focused, conversations ceased instantly. Someone was entering the courtroom. The girl's ears perked, her body shifting with curiosity. She straightened in her seat, her earlier boredom evaporating in an instant. Unlike the adults, she wasn't expecting a new witness or evidence. For her, it was simply a new character in this strange play. Her mother leaned down slightly, whispering, "Remember, be quiet now." But the little girl barely heard her. Her eyes widened, curiosity sparking like a tiny flame. Through the door stepped a uniformed police officer, tall and steady. His presence commanded respect. Broad shoulders, polished badge, every step measured and confident. But it wasn't the officer that captured the child's full attention. It was what walked beside him. On a short, sturdy leash, a large, well-trained police dog entered the courtroom. Its sleek coat shone under the dull lights, its ears perked, its movements controlled. The animal radiated discipline, walking gracefully alongside its handler, eyes scanning the room with a quiet alertness. The girl gasped softly, her mouth forming a little O. Her boredom was gone, replaced with fascination. Her tiny hands clapped together once in excitement before her mother quickly hushed her. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, ever so slightly. For the jury and attorneys, the dog represented evidence, order, and law enforcement, a piece of the trial puzzle that might prove pivotal in the pursuit of justice. For the judge, it was a symbol of authority, of credibility, of trust. But for the little girl, the dog was none of those things. To her, it was simply a puppy. Her eyes sparkled with joy as she leaned forward on the bench, nearly slipping off in her eagerness to see better. Her mother held her back gently, whispering sternly in her ear, but it was too late. The child's attention was locked. The officer walked the dog to the witness stand, the animal sitting obediently by his side. Its tail flicked once, then stilled. The dog was trained to remain calm under pressure, and it did exactly that. But even its calmness only deepened the child's awe. For the rest of the courtroom, the next few minutes were about sworn testimony, procedure, and formality. For the little girl, it was about a wagging tail and a pair of soft brown eyes that seemed to notice her. She tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Why's the puppy here?" She whispered again, her voice filled with innocence. Her mother pressed a finger to her lips. Quiet now. The little girl tried. She really did. But her excitement was bubbling, and her mind was already forming words. Words that, in just a moment, would travel across the solemn courtroom, interrupting its rigid structure and changing its atmosphere in ways no one could have predicted. And so, in the midst of a heavy trial, where lives and justice hung in the balance, a child sat on the edge of her seat, waiting, watching, her heart full of innocence. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to speak. And when she did, her voice would shake the entire room. The creak of the heavy wooden door seemed to echo longer than usual, as though the sound itself carried meaning. The entire courtroom stilled, every head turning toward the source. The judge paused mid-note, his pen hovering over his papers. The prosecutor glanced up sharply, her expression a careful blend of curiosity and readiness. Even the defense attorney, who had been scribbling furiously on a yellow pad, raised his eyes. From the shadows of the doorway, the figure of a police officer appeared. His posture was crisp, his presence commanding, the weight of his badge catching the dim light. He walked with the steady, purposeful stride of someone who had walked into countless tense situations and knew exactly how to hold a room's attention. But it wasn't the man alone who silenced the courtroom. It was the dog walking beside him. The animal was large, muscular, and composed. Its glossy black and tan coat gleamed under the pale fluorescent lighting. A thick leather collar rested around its neck, attached to a sturdy leash that the officer held firmly but lightly, as though handler and partner shared an unspoken trust. The dog's dark eyes scanned the room, not nervously, but with sharp intelligence. Its every movement suggested discipline, the kind that came from years of training and loyalty. A ripple moved through the courtroom. For some, it was awe. For others, discomfort. Dogs were not an everyday sight in such formal spaces, and their presence brought with it a weight of meaning. To the jury, it was a reminder. This was no ordinary trial. Evidence had been gathered, lives had been risked, and justice relied on more than just words. The officer led his partner forward. With each step, the dog moved gracefully, alert but calm, radiating a strange mix of strength and reassurance. The spectators leaned forward, some whispering under their breath. Reporters, who had been jotting down dry notes, suddenly found their pens racing again. The K-9 unit's arrival was a story within the story. And yet, among all the solemn adults, it was one tiny pair of eyes that lit up the brightest. In the back row, the toddler sat bolt upright. Her boredom, her fidgeting, her restless sighs, all of it vanished the moment she spotted the dog. Her mouth opened wide in wonder, her round cheeks flushing with excitement. "Puppy," she whispered in delight, tugging at her mother's sleeve. Her mother stiffened, giving her daughter a stern look and pressing a finger quickly to her lips. "Not now," she murmured softly, her voice urgent. But the toddler hardly heard. Her entire world had shifted the moment the four-legged newcomer walked in. She leaned forward as far as the bench allowed, her tiny hands gripping the polished wood in front of her. Her eyes followed the dog's every move, as though it was the most magical thing she had ever seen. She didn't notice the officer's crisp uniform, or the serious glances being exchanged among lawyers. To her, the dog wasn't evidence or duty. It was simply a wonderful living creature. The officer brought the dog to the front of the courtroom, stopping at the witness stand. As if on cue, the dog sat beside him, lowering its haunches to the floor with military precision. Its tail brushed against the wood once, then stilled, its gaze fixed firmly ahead. It was perfectly trained, prepared to remain motionless until its handler gave a command. The judge gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his expression still controlled, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of interest. He was used to officers taking the stand, but AK-9's presence was rare. It wasn't just evidence. It was a statement. The room, once rigid with unspoken tension, now carried a subtle shift. The dog's presence, silent and steady, seemed to ground the space in an unexpected way. In the back, the toddler gasped softly, clutching her mother's arm. "He's sitting like me," she whispered. "She," her mother urged again, panic flashing across her face. She could feel the eyes of nearby spectators turning, their curiosity piqued not just by the dog, but by the child's unfiltered excitement. But the girl couldn't help herself. To her, the dog wasn't a trained professional risking its life in service of justice. It was a friend waiting to be praised. The officer raised his right hand, swearing the oath to tell the truth. His voice was deep, confident, practiced. He began to testify, recounting the steps that had led him and his partner to the evidence in question. The jury leaned in, pencils scratching as they recorded details. The defense shifted uncomfortably, readying their objections. The judge listened intently, his hands folded beneath his chin. And all the while, the toddler's gaze never left the dog. The seriousness of the words spoken, about searches, suspects, and trails followed through dark nights, meant nothing to her. The story unfolding was one she couldn't understand, not at her age. But she understood the dog. She understood the calm way it sat, the way its ears twitched, the way its tail flicked gently against the floor. To her, those details spoke louder than any lawyer. She leaned closer to her mother again. "He's a good puppy," she whispered, her voice carrying just a little too far this time. Her mother's eyes widened, her hand immediately covering the child's mouth. But a few jurors, closest to the back row, glanced sideways, barely suppressing smiles. The officer continued his testimony, but the dog, perhaps sensing the child's gaze, shifted its head slightly, its eyes landing on the little girl. Its tail gave a small, slow wag. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but to the child it was everything. Her eyes widened further, and her breath caught. In her heart, it wasn't just a dog anymore. It was her dog, if only for this moment. The courtroom, however, was still draped in formality. The judge cleared his throat, motioning for the prosecutor to continue. Lawyers rattled off their questions. Responses flowed, and the rhythm of testimony resumed. To everyone else, this was just another witness in the long, difficult march toward justice. But at the back of the room, something powerful was building. The child, brimming with innocent admiration, could no longer contain the words bubbling inside her. Words that seemed too small to matter in such a grand, solemn room. Words that, when spoken, would carry more weight than anyone could have expected. The officer paused briefly in his testimony, adjusting his stance. The silence between his words became the opening the little girl had been waiting for. She drew in a deep breath. And in that moment, with the entire courtroom hanging on the next sentence of a police officer, a child's voice prepared to interrupt, changing everything. The courtroom was wrapped in an uneasy quiet, the kind of silence that carried weight. Every word from the officer at the witness stand felt heavy, deliberate, each detail stitching itself into the case. The jury scribbled furiously, their heads bobbing up and down as they tried to keep pace with the testimony. The defense shifted in his chair, occasionally adjusting his glasses, trying to keep his composure under the judge's watchful eye. But in the back row, the trial was no longer about crime, justice, or law. To a 3-year-old, it was about one thing only: the dog. The child sat up straighter, her small fingers clinging to the wooden rail in front of her. Her legs, too short to touch the ground, swung restlessly beneath the bench. She had really tried to listen to her mother's instructions. Sit still. Be quiet. This is important. But how could she? There, only a few feet away, was the most extraordinary creature she had ever seen in such a serious place. She tilted her head, studying the dog with the sharp focus only a child could muster. The canine sat still, disciplined, its ears twitching slightly whenever its handler shifted. Its eyes were deep, intelligent, unwavering. The dog seemed to belong to the courtroom in a way no other animal could. Yet, to her innocent mind, it didn't belong to the world of laws and trials. It belonged to the world of wagging tails, soft fur, and bedtime story puppies. "Why's Puppy here?" she whispered again, tugging at her mother's arm. Her mother leaned down, panic flashing in her eyes. "Sweetheart, you must be quiet. People are listening very carefully." The toddler blinked, her lips pursed in frustration. She wasn't trying to be naughty. She was trying to understand. Her little mind, full of questions and wonder, couldn't match the seriousness of the adults around her. To her, silence wasn't reverence, it was boring. And worse, it meant nobody was talking to the dog, who clearly deserved some attention. The judge adjusted his robe, leaning slightly forward as the officer continued. The prosecutor fired off another sharp question, her tone brisk and calculated. The defense objected, his voice cutting into the air, only to be overruled with a quick rap of the gavel. But the child's eyes never left the dog. It was as though the rest of the world had faded. The clicking of pens, the shuffling of papers, the solemn intonations of adults, it all blurred into background noise. In her small heart, she felt something no one else did. She saw not a piece of evidence, not a symbol of authority, but a friend. A good friend. Her mother's hand rested firmly on her knee, trying to keep her grounded. "Please, not a sound," she whispered urgently, glancing nervously toward the bailiff, who stood tall near the wall. The little girl nodded obediently. For a moment, she stayed quiet. She swung her feet back and forth, her wide eyes still locked on the canine, her lips pressed together, as if holding in the words was the hardest task she had ever faced. But the silence was too much. The weight of the moment was too heavy for her tiny frame. She felt it bubbling inside her, like when she couldn't hold in a laugh during church, or when she had to say thank you right away, because it couldn't wait. This wasn't just a want. It was a need. The officer paused in his testimony, flipping a page of his notes. The courtroom hushed even deeper, waiting for him to continue. It was in that tiny, fragile pause that the little girl's resolve broke. Her voice rang out, pure and unfiltered. "Good dog." Two small words, spoken with the clarity of truth, cut through the solemn air like a bell. They weren't loud, but they carried. The stillness of the courtroom amplified them, making sure every ear heard. The effect was instant. The officer froze mid-motion, his pen poised in his hand. His eyes flickered down to his partner, the loyal canine sitting by his side. The dog, as though recognizing the words, tilted its head slightly, its tail brushing against the wooden floor, once in a slow wag. A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. The jury turned their heads toward the back row. The prosecutor's mouth opened slightly, caught off guard by the interruption. The defense blinked, momentarily thrown off his strategy. Even the judge lifted his chin, his stern expression softening for the briefest moment. And then came the most remarkable thing of all. Silence stretched again, but this time it was lighter, filled not with heaviness, but with something unspoken. The toddler sat proudly, her eyes glowing with the satisfaction of finally saying what she felt. She didn't understand the stir she had caused. To her, she had simply spoken the truth. The dog was undeniably a good dog. Her mother, mortified, pulled her close and whispered hurriedly, "Oh my goodness, why did you say that? We're in court." She glanced around, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. But no reprimand came. No gavel slammed down. No angry words from the judge. Because the room, for all its seriousness, had been touched by something none of them expected: innocence. The officer, recovering from his pause, allowed a small smile to tug at the corner of his lips. He gave his canine partner a quick pat on the head, subtle enough not to break protocol, but just enough to acknowledge the moment. His eyes briefly flicked toward the back row, meeting the toddler's gaze. And in that fleeting glance, something profound passed between them. A trial was about truth, evidence, justice. But this was about something simpler: trust, loyalty, the honesty of a child's words. The judge, who had built a career on strict order and solemnity, leaned back in his chair. His lips pressed together, hiding the smile that threatened to form. He tapped his gavel once, not harshly, but as a gentle reminder of decorum. Yet even his eyes betrayed a warmth rarely seen in his courtroom. The prosecutor adjusted her papers, her lips twitching as though suppressing a grin. The defense exhaled sharply, shaking his head with the ghost of amusement. The jury shifted in their seats, a few of them letting their pens rest momentarily, as though savoring the unexpected break from tension. And all the while, the child simply beamed. For her, it wasn't disruption. It wasn't rebellion. It was truth. She had seen something pure and worthy in the dog and spoken it aloud. And in doing so, she had pierced the formality of the courtroom with a moment of innocence that no one could ignore. The trial wasn't over. The stakes were still high, the testimony still vital, the verdict still hanging in the balance. But from that moment forward, the air was different. The heaviness had cracked, if only slightly, replaced by a reminder that behind all the laws and procedures, humanity still existed. And it had taken the voice of a child to show them. The courtroom settled again, but the moment lingered. No one would forget the sound of her words, the way they echoed in a room so unused to such simplicity. 2 words. That was all it took. And the trial would never feel the same again. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to pause. The little girl's words, Two small syllables floated in the courtroom air, suspended as though no one dared breathe them away. Good dog. Simple, innocent, yet powerful enough to silence an entire chamber of adults who had spent days wrapped in tension. The officer at the witness stand froze mid-motion. His eyes flicked down at his canine partner, who, as if perfectly timed, tilted its head toward the child's voice. The dog's ears perked, and its tail gave a slow, deliberate wag against the polished wooden floor. The sound was soft, but in the hush of the courtroom, it landed like a drumbeat. The toddler gasped softly at the tail's movement, her face lighting up in triumphant delight. In her mind, there was no trial, no evidence, no loss. There was just her and the dog, a connection sealed by her praise. The jury shifted in their seats, their carefully neutral expressions cracking. A few lips trembled with suppressed smiles. One juror, an older woman with a stern face, raised a hand to cover her mouth, but her eyes betrayed warmth. Another juror, a younger man, pressed his pencil against his notepad, tapping nervously as if fighting the urge to chuckle. At the prosecutor's table, papers shuffled as she adjusted them unnecessarily, her composure rattled by the interruption. Her lips pressed into a line, but the corners twitched upward despite herself. Even she, sharp as a blade in court, could not entirely ignore the sweetness of the moment. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, letting out the faintest exhale, somewhere between a sigh and a chuckle. His case strategy had been momentarily hijacked by a 3-year-old, and even he couldn't deny the absurdity. The judge was the last to react. His gavel rested near his hand, ready to strike for order, but his stern face softened as he looked toward the back row. The mother, mortified, was whispering frantically into her daughter's ear, her face flushed with embarrassment. She hugged the child close, as though trying to absorb her into invisibility. But the judge's gaze lingered, his eyes betraying something unusual, amusement. He tapped the gavel lightly, not the sharp crack of reprimand, but a soft toke that felt more like acknowledgement. "Let us proceed," he said evenly, though his voice carried an undertone of warmth, rarely heard in his courtroom. But the shift had already taken root. The officer cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. He gave his canine a subtle pat on the head, a gesture he rarely allowed in such formal settings. But this time, it felt right. The bond between handler and dog was unbreakable, and the child's 2 words had reminded everyone of what that bond meant. "Good dog," the little girl had said. And she was right. This wasn't just a working animal, not just a piece of evidence or a silent partner in a case. This was loyalty made flesh, trust on 4 legs. The kind of goodness that was undeniable, even to a child too young to know the word justice. A ripple moved through the courtroom, like a breeze breaking through stale air. The atmosphere had been heavy, oppressive, filled with legal jargon and cold logic. Now it was lighter, human. The bailiff, who had stood stiffly against the wall, allowed himself the faintest grin before straightening again. The stenographer, who had been typing every word with robotic efficiency, paused briefly, her fingers hovering over the keys, as though debating whether to record the child's words verbatim. For the jury, the moment lingered. They had been listening to testimony after testimony, absorbing grim facts, dissecting difficult arguments. Many of them had grown weary, their minds dulled by the endless cycle of procedure. But the child's voice, pure, unfiltered, honest, broke through that fog. It reminded them of something essential, that beneath all the layers of law, humanity still mattered. The prosecutor rose to her feet again, her heels clicking against the floor as she tried to reclaim the room. "Officer," she began, her voice steadier now, "please continue describing the events of..." But her words were cut short by a ripple of quiet laughter from the gallery. Not disrespectful laughter, not mocking, but soft, genuine amusement. It spread slowly, carefully, like people testing the boundaries of what was allowed. Even the strict judge didn't silence it immediately. He let it linger, just long enough for the room to exhale the breath it had been holding for hours. The mother whispered desperately to her daughter, "Please, no more talking." The little girl looked up at her with innocent confusion. To her, she hadn't done anything wrong. She had spoken the truth. The dog was good, and wasn't that worth saying? The canine officer glanced briefly at the judge, then at the prosecutor, before returning his gaze to the child. It wasn't often that he broke formality, but he let the moment stand. He gave the leash a gentle tug, and the dog straightened slightly, as if standing taller from the praise. The handler smiled faintly, a private acknowledgement to the little girl. "Thank you." He needed that too. For the officer, the words carried weight. His partner wasn't just a tool of justice. This dog had saved lives, chased suspects, found evidence others could not. And yet, no matter the duty, to him it had always been simple. His partner was a good dog. Now, a child had said it aloud, in a place where such truths were rarely spoken. The judge finally tapped the gavel again, more firmly this time. "Order, please. We must proceed." But even his tone was gentler than usual. The laughter died down, but the smiles remained. The prosecutor sighed softly and began again, resuming her questioning. The defense scribbled more notes, his face composed, but his eyes still glinting with amusement. The jury turned their pens back to the paper. Though a few stole glances at the little girl in the back row, their expressions softened. But beneath the resumed formality, the courtroom wasn't the same anymore. Something had shifted permanently. The little girl leaned her head against her mother's arm, her mission complete. She didn't fully grasp the stir she had caused. To her, it had been simple. The dog was good, and she wanted the world to know it. Her mother stroked her hair anxiously, still red-faced, but relieved no punishment had come. The toddler closed her eyes briefly, satisfied, her small legs still swinging absent-mindedly beneath the bench. The adults moved on, or at least pretended to. The officer continued his testimony. The lawyers built their arguments. The judge maintained order. But in the hearts of everyone present, the two words echoed. Good dog. Innocence had spoken louder than law, and for a fleeting moment, the courtroom remembered what it was like to be human. The hush that had fallen over the courtroom after the toddler's small but powerful interruption slowly began to dissolve into something rare, something almost unheard of in a place designed for solemnity and control. It started as a ripple. A low chuckle came from the back, quickly stifled by the person's hand pressed firmly against their mouth. A few shoulders shook, eyes sparkled, and then, like a wave breaking against stone, the room erupted into a soft cascade of laughter. It wasn't mocking, nor disrespectful. It was genuine, light-hearted, and unifying, like a collective exhale everyone hadn't realized they were holding. The jury, who had been instructed repeatedly to remain neutral and emotionless, could no longer keep their composure. The older woman juror with the stern face let out a laugh that sounded more like relief than amusement. She shook her head, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from joy she hadn't felt in days. The young man on the jury allowed himself a grin, so wide his pen slipped from his hand and rolled onto the floor with a clatter, which only made his neighbor snicker more. Soon, the entire jury box was caught in the moment, their human side shining through, despite all the courtroom training to mask it. At the prosecutor's table, the woman tried valiantly to maintain her professionalism. She pressed her lips into a tight line, organizing papers with sharp, deliberate movements, as if the neat stack of legal documents might restore her authority. But it was a losing battle. Her eyes flicked up, catching the sight of the canine wagging its tail proudly, and even she felt her lips twitch into the faintest smile. It was no use pretending. It was funny, and it was touching. The defense attorney, on the other hand, didn't bother to hide his amusement. He leaned back comfortably in his chair, one arm draped casually over its edge. For the first time since the trial began, his posture suggested ease. The corner of his mouth curled upward, a silent acknowledgement that the trial's suffocating seriousness had been cracked open by the smallest of voices. The mother, however, was mortified. She cradled her daughter, whispering frantic apologies under her breath. Her cheeks burned crimson as she mouthed "I'm sorry" to the judge, to the bailiff, to anyone who would meet her eyes. She tried to hush her daughter again, though the child looked utterly confused at the reaction she had caused. Why was everyone laughing? She hadn't told a joke. She had told the truth. And then there was the judge. Known for his no-nonsense demeanor, he had presided over countless trials with iron control, his gavel a weapon of order. But even he was not immune. His hand covered his mouth for a moment, as though he were adjusting his glasses. But it was obvious. The corners of his lips had curved upward. His usually sharp eyes softened, betraying a man who, underneath the robe, was human like the rest of them. He lifted his gavel, and the room stilled in anticipation. Would he scold them? Call for silence? Demand the child be removed? But instead, he struck the gavel with a measured, gentle tap. Not sharp, not angry, almost playful. Order, he said, though his tone lacked its usual severity. His voice carried a warmth none had heard from him before. Order, please, let us compose ourselves. The laughter subsided, though smiles lingered like a warmth that refused to be extinguished. The jurors wiped their eyes. The lawyers straightened their postures, still fighting the traces of their amusement. Even the bailiff, usually stone-faced, had to look away to hide his grin. The K-9, oblivious to the social rules of the courtroom, wagged its tail with renewed vigor, clearly pleased by the attention. Its handler gave it a discreet pat on the side, whispering something only the dog could hear. The officer's face betrayed pride not just in his partner, but in the child who had recognized the goodness that everyone else often forgot to acknowledge. The judge cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. Now, he said, more softly than usual, we shall continue. But let it be noted. He paused, glancing briefly toward the gallery where the mother and child sat. Sometimes the simplest truths arrive in the smallest voices. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, softer than laughter, but just as united. The prosecutor, seizing the chance to regain footing, stood once more. She smoothed her suit jacket and said firmly, "Officer, let's proceed with the testimony." Yet even she couldn't resist glancing back at the child, her expression more gentle now than it had been all trial. The defense scribbled notes again, but his eyes sparkled with mischief. He leaned slightly toward his client, whispering something that caused a faint smile to appear on the defendant's face, though quickly hidden, lest it seem disrespectful. The jury leaned forward, refreshed. Their earlier fatigue seemed to have vanished. The weight of the case still loomed over them, but the child's words had reminded them they were not merely arbiters of cold evidence. They were human beings making human decisions. And the mother? She held her daughter close, still whispering apologies, but a small part of her heart swelled with pride. Yes, she had broken the silence of a courtroom, but hadn't she also reminded them all of something pure? She stroked her daughter's hair, torn between embarrassment and awe at the power of two tiny words. The little girl, satisfied with her declaration, leaned against her mother's arm, her job done. She didn't understand the waves she had caused, the laughter she had inspired, or the way her words would echo long after the trial ended. To her, she had simply spoken the truth. The dog was good, and everyone had heard it. From that moment forward, the trial was different. The air was lighter. Witnesses entered the room with less fear. Lawyers delivered their questions with less edge. Even the judge's gavel seemed to fall with less weight. The child had unknowingly shifted the tone of the proceedings, replacing cold rigidity with a reminder of humanity. For the rest of the day, whenever silence fell too heavily, eyes flickered toward the canine or the child, and faint smiles returned. The trial moved on, but the echo of laughter never entirely left. And though no one admitted it aloud, deep down, they all knew. They had just witnessed something unforgettable. The trial resumed. Voices steadied, questions continued, and the gavel tapped occasionally to remind everyone of procedure. Yet, underneath the surface, something had shifted. It wasn't just a funny moment anymore. It had become something deeper, a reminder that in the search for justice, symbols of loyalty and innocence mattered as much as facts and figures. The canine sat obediently at his handler's side, calm but alert. His dark eyes scanned the room with quiet intelligence, ears flicking at each sound. But now, every glance toward him was different. He was no longer seen as merely a police dog or evidence support. He was, in the minds of many, the very picture of honesty and trust. The jurors couldn't shake the image of the toddler's soft voice praising him. They replayed it in their minds like a melody, two words echoing in different tones for each of them. Good dog. It wasn't just about the animal. It was about truth, purity, the kind of certainty that couldn't be corrupted. For days, they had been bombarded with contradictions. Lawyers twisting words, witnesses hesitating, facts bent and reshaped to fit narratives. But the child's voice cut through all of that. She had seen the dog for what it was, and she had spoken the truth without hesitation. In that sense, she was no different from the dog itself. The K9 couldn't lie. It couldn't fabricate. It could only do what it was trained to do. Find what was hidden, follow the trail, remain loyal to its partner. That was what made canine testimony so powerful in court. Unlike humans, the dog's actions carried no agenda. They were pure. The prosecutor, sensing the shift, leaned into it. She began emphasizing the role of the canine in the case, highlighting how the animal had tracked evidence and provided clarity when humans could not. This dog, she said firmly during questioning, did not waver. This dog did not invent or imagine. It followed its training. It found what others missed. And it did so with complete loyalty and honesty. The jury nodded, some almost unconsciously. They trusted the dog more than some of the human witnesses who had sat trembling in that same stand. And wasn't that telling? The defense attorney, though sharp, recognized the difficulty now. Arguing against evidence tied to the K9 risked appearing as though he was arguing against loyalty itself. And after the child's declaration, any attack on the dog would feel personal to the jury. The animal wasn't just a piece of the case anymore. It was a symbol, validated by innocence. The officer, still at the stand, spoke more softly now, his hand occasionally brushing the dog's head. "He's more than my partner," the officer admitted, perhaps emboldened by the moment. "He's my protector. He's saved my life more than once. And he never asks for anything in return. Not even thanks." His voice caught slightly, and the jury leaned in. The little girl in the back row perked up at the words. She whispered again, a little louder than she should have, "Good dog," repeating herself with absolute conviction. This time, her mother didn't hush her immediately. Instead, she sighed and let it hang there for a heartbeat before gently patting her daughter's knee. The courtroom softened again. Not laughter this time, no, something quieter. Reverence, respect. The judge adjusted his glasses, his gaze thoughtful. He didn't scold. He didn't demand silence. Instead, he let the child's second declaration settle into the air like a benediction. For the witnesses waiting outside, word of the moment traveled quickly. Those about to testify heard whispers. The little girl called the dog good. The jury laughed. Even the judge smiled. And strangely, it gave them courage. If a child could speak her truth so freely, maybe they could too. One nervous witness who had been reluctant to testify against the defendant found strength in that innocence. When she was called in later that day, she stood taller. She kept her eyes on the K9, drawing strength from its quiet presence. The dog, in return, stared back with calm steadiness, and her voice grew stronger as she answered each question. The symbol grew. It wasn't just a dog anymore. It was everything people hoped justice could be. Loyal, unwavering, pure. And it was the toddler who had reminded them. Her voice, so untainted by fear or manipulation, had anchored the truth in the room. The defense tried to steer around it, avoiding references to the K9 altogether, but the avoidance only made its presence louder. The jury couldn't unsee what they had seen, couldn't unhear what they had heard. In their minds, trust had been placed on forepaws, and it was unshakable. The mother sat back quietly now, less embarrassed and more contemplative. She stroked her daughter's hair and realized something profound. Her little girl had cut through the noise of adult games, lies, and pretenses with two simple words. She hadn't just praised a dog. She had spoken to something deeper inside every person in the room. The judge, later that evening in his chambers, would reflect privately on the moment. He had presided over hundreds of cases, seen hardened criminals, desperate pleas, and legal trickery of every kind. But never had he seen an entire courtroom united by the voice of a child. It reminded him of why he had taken the robe in the first place, not just to enforce law, but to seek truth wherever it was found. And here, truth had come from the mouth of a toddler. As the officer finished his testimony, he gave the dog another subtle pat. The jury's eyes followed the gesture, and they saw it too. This wasn't just a partner. This was trust embodied. The little girl yawned softly, resting her head against her mother's shoulder, already drifting toward sleep. She had no idea she had become the voice of the trial's turning point. To her, the day was long, the benches were uncomfortable, and the dog was simply good. That was all she needed to know. But to everyone else, her words had etched themselves into memory. They weren't going away. They would be carried into deliberations, whispered in chambers, remembered in stories long after the case ended. Sometimes it seemed the simplest truths were the strongest, and all it had taken were two words: good dog. The courtroom had changed. Everyone felt it, though no one dared put it into words. Trials were meant to be machines of procedure, structured, disciplined, and devoid of unnecessary sentiment. But now, sentiment had entered anyway. It had slipped in quietly, delivered on the innocent breath of a toddler, and no gavel, no lawyer, no stern command could erase it. The child's two words still lingered like a melody in the minds of the jurors. Good dog. As the day wore on, testimony after testimony continued. The lawyers pressed on, asking their sharp-edged questions, delivering objections with practiced precision. But under it all, the weight that had once pressed down on the room was lighter. The toddler's declaration had cracked the courtroom's stone exterior, and through that crack, light had poured in. Witnesses who entered the room felt it first. One woman, who had been trembling outside in the hall, found herself steadier when she walked past the K9. She looked at its calm eyes and thought about the child's words. The dog wasn't frightening. It was steady, safe, loyal. She straightened her shoulders and testified with a confidence she hadn't felt earlier in the week. A man who had been called as a reluctant witness felt something similar. He had dreaded facing the jury, afraid his words might be twisted or doubted. But when he took the stand, his gaze landed on the dog. Sitting so still, so dignified, the animal exuded honesty. The man spoke more clearly than expected, his words unshaken. The jury listened differently too, their softened expressions reflecting a readiness to hear without immediate judgment. The jurors themselves, once stiff with neutrality, had begun to lean forward during testimony. They weren't just processing evidence anymore. They were absorbing humanity. For them, the toddler had reminded them why they were there. It wasn't just about laws and codes. It was about people, their choices, their mistakes, their truths. And always, at the center, was the dog. The officer who handled the K-9 remained at his post, quiet but reflective. He had spent years working alongside his four-legged partner. He knew the dog's value, knew how many times it had found what humans missed, hidden drugs, crucial clues, even frightened children. But now, for the first time, he saw his partner through the eyes of others. To the jury, the dog wasn't just an officer's tool. It was the embodiment of trust. To the child, it was simply good. That thought struck him harder than he expected. He thought about the nights he had doubted whether all the long hours, the danger, and the weight of his job truly mattered. He thought about moments when he had nearly lost his life, when his dog had leapt between him and danger without hesitation. The child's words, so simple, so small, carried all of that meaning. Good dog, yes, his partner was good. Beyond the work, beyond the law, beyond the uniform, that was the truth. As he glanced at the little girl sitting in the gallery, now leaning against her mother's shoulder, he felt a rare surge of gratitude. She didn't even realize what she had done, but her words had breathed humanity back into a room that had forgotten how to feel. The defense attorney noticed it too. His strategy had depended on doubt, making jurors question every angle, every word, every witness. But now doubt was harder to plant. The jurors' softened expressions, their readiness to listen, their connection to the dog's symbolic honesty, all of it threatened his careful work. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing that the trial had tilted in a direction he couldn't fully control. The prosecutor, on the other hand, leaned into the change. She began weaving the dog into her narrative, reminding the jury again and again of its steady reliability. She didn't overdo it. She didn't need to. The jury already felt it. But every time she emphasized the dog's role in finding key evidence, she knew she was aligning her case with the symbol that had already captured their hearts. The judge, though silent, was not unaffected. He sat straighter in his chair, but the severity in his gaze had softened. His mind drifted more than once to the little girl's voice, and he found himself reflecting on his own career. Years of trials, years of harsh sentences, years of faces hardened by crime, and yet here, innocence had walked in and reminded him of something important. Justice wasn't just punishment. Justice was truth. By the afternoon, the courtroom felt almost unrecognizable from its earlier days. Where tension had once ruled, there was calm. Where fear had silenced, there was courage. Where neutrality had dulled, there was attentiveness. The little girl, oblivious to the depth of her impact, began humming quietly against her mother's arm. She swung her legs, tapping her shoes softly against the bench. To her, it was just another long day. The adults were talking too much. The room was too serious. But at least the dog was there. The dog was good, and that was enough for her. Her mother stroked her hair, still embarrassed by the disruption, but also quietly moved. She realized something profound. Her daughter had spoken with more clarity and honesty than most adults dared to. She hadn't worried about rules or appearances or consequences. She had just spoken the truth as she saw it, and in doing so, she had changed the course of a trial. Toward the end of the day, the judge called for recess. The jurors stood, stretching stiffly, some exchanging faint smiles with each other. The lawyers gathered their papers. The officer guided his K9 out, and the gallery emptied. But as the room cleared, the air still held the echo of those two words. In the hallway, jurors spoke softly among themselves. "That little girl," one began, trailing off with a shake of the head and a smile. Another nodded. "She said what we were all thinking. That dog is something else." The officer, walking beside his dog, felt a swell of pride in his chest. He reached down, scratching the animal's head. "You're not just a good dog," he murmured quietly. "You're the best." The dog leaned into his touch, tail swaying gently, as though it understood. And somewhere down the hall, the little girl's laughter rang out, light and pure, chasing away the heaviness of the courthouse walls. She didn't know she had changed the day. She didn't know she had reminded everyone of something greater than law. But the adults knew. The emotional shift was undeniable. The trial was no longer just about crime, evidence, and verdicts. It had become about something far more human, about loyalty, innocence, and truth. And it all began with two words, spoken by the smallest voice in the room. "Good dog." The trial finally reached its end, though the echo of that toddler's voice never truly left the courtroom. Long after the lawyers had delivered their closing arguments, and the judge had given his final instructions to the jury, people still remembered the small voice that had pierced through the formality of the proceeding with nothing more than two simple words. "Good dog." In the tense days that followed, the jury deliberated. It was not an easy decision. They had been asked to weigh evidence, testimony, and credibility in a case that affected lives deeply. Yet even in that enclosed room, behind closed doors, the jurors couldn't help but mention that moment. One juror later admitted that when things grew tense in their deliberations, someone would inevitably say, "Remember the little girl and the dog?" And the weight of conflict would soften. It reminded them that justice, while heavy, was not without humanity. Meanwhile, the officer and his loyal K9 partner walked the courthouse halls, waiting for the verdict. For him, the trial had been just another part of the duty, but the child's voice had made it unforgettable. Each time he thought back to that instant, he found himself smiling. His partner, the dog who had sat so patiently, had reminded everyone of loyalty, truth, and simplicity without ever saying a word. But the toddler had given those qualities a voice, two small words that carried enormous power. The judge, too, found himself reflecting in his private chambers. Normally stern, he rarely let personal emotions interfere with his work. Yet when he wrote his notes at the end of the trial, he scribbled one line that had nothing to do with law or evidence. "Innocence brings clarity." He didn't share it with anyone, but it stayed in his mind. He knew that despite years of presiding over cases, this trial would remain etched in his memory not because of legal arguments, but because of the unexpected interruption of a child's unfiltered honesty. The verdict eventually came. Justice was delivered, and the case closed. Yet the story didn't end there. The courthouse staff told the story to others, retelling the moment in the break room, smiling as they remembered how the solemn courtroom had cracked into laughter and warmth. For many, who were used to the weight of trials, it was a rare reminder that courtrooms weren't just about rules, they were about people. And people, no matter how burdened, still needed moments of innocence. The little girl, of course, had no idea what she had done. To her, she had simply seen a dog, an unusually well-behaved one, and given it the praise it deserved. Children often say what adults feel, but cannot express. Where the jurors had sat rigid and quiet, secretly admiring the animal's loyalty, the child had spoken aloud. Her two words had given the whole room permission to release its tension, if only for a moment. Her mother, though embarrassed at first, later came to see the beauty of it. At home, she told her daughter, "You made everyone smile today." The girl tilted her head, confused. "Why?" she asked. "Because you are honest," the mother replied. That honesty was something adults often lost in the pursuit of seriousness, but children carried it without even trying. The officer and his K-9 left the courthouse with a new sense of pride. As they walked down the steps, reporters swarmed for comments about the trial, but a few asked about the dog. "Was that your partner in court?" One asked. He nodded. Another reporter chuckled and added, "People are still talking about that little girl's words." The officer smiled. "Well," he said, patting his dog's head, "she wasn't wrong. He is a good dog." News of the moment spread further than anyone expected. A small piece ran in the local paper, tucked between heavier stories about the trial, describing how a toddler had broken the tension of the courtroom with her simple praise. That story was picked up by a larger outlet, then another, until soon people across the state and even the country were hearing about it. In a world often weighed down with conflict, corruption, and crime, the story was a breath of fresh air. People shared it on social media, smiling as they read about the honesty of a child and the loyalty of a dog. For the officer, it was humbling. He had dedicated years to serving with his K-9 partner, often underappreciated. But now, through the voice of a toddler, the world saw the dog as more than just a tool for law enforcement. They saw him as a living symbol of trust, protection, and unconditional loyalty. The child's words gave the animal recognition that no official commendation could. As for the jury, they returned to their lives with a memory that outlasted the verdict. One juror later admitted to her husband that she would never forget the sight of the officer standing tall, the K-9 by his side, and the little girl's innocent voice praising him in the most natural way. "It reminded me why I believe in truth," she confessed. "Because sometimes the purest truth doesn't come from adults. It comes from children." Months later, when the officer attended a community event with his K-9, he spotted the same mother and child in the crowd. The girl, now a little taller, ran up to the dog with wide eyes. "Good dog," she repeated, this time louder, more confident. The officer laughed, kneeling down to let her pet the animal. "He remembers you," the officer told her mother. The crowd watched, smiling, as the girl hugged the dog. It was more than just a sweet reunion. It was a full circle, a reminder that some moments never fade. The courtroom had long since moved on to other cases, filled again with arguments, rulings, and verdicts. But for those who had been there on that day, the memory of the child's words lingered. Judges would sometimes mention it quietly to new clerks. Officers told the story in training sessions, reminding recruits that justice was about people, not just paperwork. And the mother, whenever her daughter asked about the puppy in the big room, would smile and say, "You made history that day, even if you don't remember it." In the end, what remained was not just the outcome of the trial, but the reminder of humanity that had broken through its walls. Two words, simple, innocent, and pure, had done what long speeches and heavy arguments could not. They had united people, even if only for a moment. They had reminded everyone present that behind justice, behind the law, there was still life. And so, years later, when people spoke of that trial, they did not recall the legal strategies or the technical details of evidence. They remembered the little girl, the police dog, and the way two words had changed the room. Because sometimes the most lasting memories are not the ones carved into law books, but the ones spoken softly, sincerely, and without agenda. Two words, one child, one dog, and a courtroom forever changed.